Welcome to a very special session here at the 2017 annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association. I'm Caroline Hendrie, and I'm the Executive Director of the Education Writers Association. And we are the national professional organization of members of the media who cover education, and we are dedicated to advancing high-quality education coverage. The theme of this year's AERA meeting is Knowledge to Action, Achieving the Promise of Equal Educational Opportunity. During this symposium, we have the very rare privilege of gathering nearly a dozen former presidents of AERA to share their thoughts on the timely and very important theme of this year's conference. Talk about a brain trust. It's really impressive. The symposium will be constructed as a conversation among these leaders and you, our audience. So we really want you to start thinking about what you want to talk about the theme of this year's conference. Before we get started, I will just briefly note that we have 35 years of AERA leadership represented here today on this stage. Pretty amazing. Yep. And I will, because our time is relatively short, relevant to the number of speakers we have, I will dispense with lengthy introductions, and most of these scholars are known to you already. So I will just read their names in chronological order from when they held office as president. And when I do read your name, just give a little wave so everybody knows who you are. Okay, so the first year represented on this list is 1980 and 1981, and that's Frank Farley.
Where's my milk and cookies?
Next, jumping ahead 15 years, we have Linda Darling-Hammond. James Banks. Catherine Snow. Gloria Ladson-Billings. William Tate. Okay. Carol Lee. Kris Gutierrez. William Tierney. Barbara Schneider. And Jeannie Oakes. So the theme of this year's conference resonates strongly with me. That's in part because our members, education journalists, are so eager for allies in shining a spotlight on issues of inequality of educational opportunity. Last year, in a national survey for EWA's first ever State of the Education Beat, education journalists were asked which issues in education receive too little attention from the media. The top issue was inequality, meaning they thought themselves it was the most undercovered issue on the education beat. So with that, I would like to start kind of in the order that I named the presidents. We'd like you to give kind of a short kind of response to your thinking about the theme of this year's conference. So, Frank, we'll start with you, please.
Okay, firstly, point out I happen to have the program from 1981. I reread it in about 20 minutes just before coming in here. And I took a look in the index, and it's interesting, social justice and such concepts weren't even in the index. The current program, there's literally dozens upon dozens under those topics. So it bespeaks a whole shift in what concerns AERA members. Wow. My feeling is that I'd like to just briefly touch on two things. One, screen, and the other is the screed, S-C-R-E-E-D. I think that we have to get foursquare onto the screen if we're going to start influencing the world along the lines of equal educational opportunity. I don't think more research is necessarily needed. You know, what do we do at these conferences? We talk to each other inside the monastery. We got to get out over the monastery walls, get out into street science and change the world. And the way to do it in the 21st century is on the screen, because that's where we all live. So I would like to see AERA literally form some kind of an entity where we put out all sorts of things for the screen in one way or another. I would get our own YouTube channel, podcast, all sorts of things to get our ideas out there if we actually are serious about changing the world on that front, on the issues that are on the burner today. And the second one, the screed, has to do, of course, with politicians, extreme viewpoints, taking strong stands, the typical definition of a screed. We need to do more about influencing politics, and I would argue that AERA should give serious thought to forming a separate but related entity where we can influence directly politicians. We can raise funds, we can support politicians who are doing the things that we think are most important and appropriate in educational change. And this has been tried in other entities. The American Psychological Association has such an entity. And in that organization, we have been able to influence dramatically legislation concerning psychologists. And so I think that AERA needs to give serious thought to forming a separate but related entity that could raise funds independently, etc., and attempt to influence the political process.
Very interesting. So Linda, next.
So I'm sitting here thinking about the prospect of an AERA PAC and wondering what that would mean. But I guess I would reinforce the notion that it's really important that we are able to carry research more directly into policy and practice. There's a huge divide, rather like the Grand Canyon, between researchers and policymakers right now. We have learned a lot about what does show promise of helping reduce opportunity gaps and promoting equal educational opportunity. You can think about the research on early childhood education and how some of that has traveled into the federal and state space. Recent studies by folks like Karabo Jackson and Rucker Johnson and Jesse Rothstein about how money does make a difference, and we can track school finance investments in the education of low-income kids to gains in attainment and income and reductions in poverty. We know a lot about teaching practices, leadership practices that reduce achievement gaps, and we know a lot about program strategies, bilingual education, and others that are important. What I think we need to be more cognizant of and more engaged in is both the carrying of that work directly to the policy community. We've started in California a new organization, the Learning Policy Institute, that has that mission. Kris is cheering, she's on the board and a senior fellow. Jeannie is also a senior fellow. I think Gloria is, and so is Carol. And we've got a lot of activity going around how to think about carrying that evidence from the research community forward, but also thinking about the research about how. We know a lot about what matters, but states and local communities and federal legislators and policymakers need to know a lot about how to do things so that they actually work. And I think that's another part of the agenda, aside from and in addition to the connections that need to be made with policymakers.
Great. So James? Yeah.
Yes, I title my kind of little talk, The Threats to Educational Equality, by the push for hypernationalism, social cohesion, and xenophobia. I'm really very concerned about with the rise of neo-nationalism, hypernationalism, and xenophobia, not only in the United States, but also in Europe with the popularity of Le Pen. We're all waiting to see what happens in the next round of the French election. And So I'm very much concerned about, Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I'm not saying, I still think that may be true, but the chilling and pernicious political climate that we have around the world makes me really worried about whether we won't have a rise of deficit theories of folks of color and of minoritized groups. How can we must act as researchers to make sure that the cultural deprivations and genetic paradigms don't resurface during this very chilling era. So I'm very concerned that we as researchers stay committed to bringing in different voices and stay committed to multicultural research, which really raises questions about who has the power to define and to institutionalize their concepts within schools, colleges, and universities. What is the relationship between knowledge and power? Who benefits from the ways in which concepts such as race, culture, and intellectual ability are defined and who loses? And how does the positionality of researchers influence the research questions, methods, and findings that they construct? In other words, I'm very concerned that we construct transformative research and make sure that the deficit in genetic theories don't resurface during this chilling period of hyper-nationalism and xenophobia.
Right. So Catherine? Yeah. Yes, you're next.
All right, well, it perhaps suggests that I don't take on huge challenges, but I'm going to stop at the colon in my comments. Before the colon, the theme is knowledge to action. And you've heard some really wonderful suggestions about the kinds of actions that need to be taken. But I want to argue that there are two routes from knowledge to action. First of all, starting with knowledge, where the knowledge comes from is highly relevant to how actionable it becomes. And I would argue that the knowledge that emerges from practice is considerably more relevant than we have generally acknowledged in this research community. But secondly, people have been talking a lot about the direct route from knowledge to action. We know this, therefore we should do this. We know that early childhood programs help kids, so we should expand them. We know that bilingual education is good, so we should organize schools that way. There's a longer and more circuitous, and I'm afraid in many, or we have to realize in many cases, more powerful route from knowledge to action via beliefs. And if we're not taking into account the values and the beliefs that our audience, the practitioners and the policymakers hold, then the knowledge that we would like to propose as actionable is not actionable. It's only actionable if it connects to people's deepest values and beliefs. And it is well established that people don't change their minds just because there are some facts that disagree with or disprove what they believe. They change their minds when they are deeply engaged in understanding alternative points of view, in acknowledging alternative perspectives, when they are engaged in the debate about the issue, not when they're just told they're wrong on the issue. And so I would see a role for AERA as one of promulgating, promoting, modeling, and informing the debate rather than trying just to disseminate the facts.
Not working, I'm sorry. Okay. Gloria, Ladson-Billings, you're next.
Okay, so predictably, I'm going to speak on the other side of the colon. The notion of achieving the promise of equal educational opportunity. My own theme was education research in the public interest. And it was a 2005-06 year, but the year before I'd been asked to be the Wallace lecturer, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision. And in doing the research for that talk, one of the things I found out is that we can't litigate ourselves to equality. it's kind of a surprise for most of us, because we've all put, particularly African Americans, have put so much stock in the courts to handle the issues that we are concerned about. So I think that one of the things that we are learning, and that this theme is pointing us to, if we're going to go to action, most of our action is at the state level. That while we may be wringing our hands and tearing our hair out about what's going on at the national level, AERA has to be much more engaged in state houses and state decisions. And when you actually realize that we don't have a constitutional right to an education, it is left to the states. In some ways, I feel like we've skipped over the state because we've tried to speak to such broad publics. So I would say that the action that we'd like to do has to happen more locally. It has to be a little bit more generative, that we don't just do this one thing over here and then run over here and do this other thing over here. And I'm actually excited about the possibility, notwithstanding Jim's fear, because I have that fear too. We've seen this movie before. But I am excited about the possibility that we can begin to do some work. And just looking at Kris reminds me that one of the things that excites me is I was in California a couple of weeks ago and Proposition 58 has passed. So there is energy in a number of more local contexts that we can turn this knowledge to action and we can achieve the promise of equal educational opportunity.
Maybe explain what that is to people who don't know. Yeah.
So Proposition 58 revives bilingual education. So given the UNS amendment, the state has come back and said, no, we actually need to be able to help people learn dual languages at least.
Thank you. William Tate's next. Yep.
So I'm going to channel a president who's not, is it on? We're on now. Channel a president who's not here, David Crothwell. Catherine and I were in a session dedicated to his memory. He had two types of things he called us to do in 1969. It was a vertical type of integration or knowledge or action, and a horizontal. And I'd like to speak to both of those as my examples. In the terms of the vertical, for my colleagues in the press, practitioners and researchers, he argues there's a need to have this engagement across these three: research. He didn't add the press, but I'm giving you a free pass here, so to speak. I'm going to add the press and people who are engaged in practice. And what I'm going to argue, if you pull out your phone, really don't do this, but I'm going to ask you to ask for the weather in the United States on Siri. Siri will not give you the weather in the United States. Siri will be confused. Ask Siri for the weather in the state of Texas. Siri will be very confused. If you say San Antonio weather, Siri will pop up with an answer. Because weather varies across boundaries, right? So do our variables that we study. In point of fact, what we need to be doing, in my opinion, is taking advantage of the technology that exists around geography and place and providing states and local municipalities with a local weather report with the variables that matter in education. And if you see it in my own state, you'll find that St. Louis and Kansas City and the southern rural Boot Heel, which is largely ignored in education research because we don't do a lot of research on rural areas, look exactly the same when you look at the weather pattern around education and health and things of that sort. But the way we talk about this is that Kansas City is a problem and St. Louis is a problem, but there's not a problem in the Boot Heel. That's why you have Trump. And so you don't have these local weather reports showing that we have this commonality together. And then we can have discussions about it geospatially, how we can resolve these things, taking Gloria's idea state by state. Secondly, on this integrated, I was here 2 weeks ago speaking to the National Council of Teachers of Math about a horizontal idea. It's controversial to tell teachers of mathematics that they could actually implement with great fidelity most of the curriculum changes they've advocated for, actually have a quality teacher perhaps in place in some of these areas, and that healthcare reform in the form of not just providing health care for children, but for families, because we know when families have health care, the kids actually get a chance to get the health care. When you just give it to kids, it doesn't have the same robust effect. If you do that, I'm going to beat you in terms of the effect sizes for math and reading achievement. So in essence, what I was telling to my friends in a horizontal way, per our good colleague who's passed away, is that healthcare reform is actually math education reform. And it's also literacy reform. But why don't we talk about it like that? We treat it like it's separate, but it's a horizontal integration that needs to be happening, and our discussions need to be happening in that way. And then we might actually get some traction. And if we combine them, I'm going to come back to the original point, by taking the local weather reports and then showing people how these horizontal relationships would work in their municipalities and the like, bam, we've got solutions. Okay, so that's my 2 cents for this.
Thank you. So Carol Lee.
So I want to start with we had a session yesterday devoted to the work of Dr. Edmund Gordon. And in that, my colleague Luis Gomez had put forth, actually he was quoting a statement that Ed had made some years ago. And the analogy was imagining ourselves in the world at a time when the dominant belief system was that the world was flat. And so you had people in boats, sort of navigating under the assumption that the science said that the world was flat, when there was emerging evidence that it wasn't flat, that it was round. And I thought from that it was a sort of a parallel to, in many ways, I think where we are right now. And that is that I think that emerging across a number of disciplines, there's converging evidence about one important, this may get a little bit to Bill's comment, very important connections between biology and participation in cultural practices in particular contexts across setting, and that human learning and development is situated in that complex kind of dynamic system. And while the convergence of knowledge is across that field about a paradigm shift, much of what we're doing is situated in, give me a one set fix, culture matters, but biology doesn't matter. Culture is some artifact that we make up in terms of how we talk about it, and that these get sort of reified in the language that we use, and that in many respects that becomes a kind of a belief system that informs these meta-narratives. And so that I think for us in the field of educational research poses significant challenges in terms of how do we begin to communicate that complexity in ways that have trench into them, that are not so complicated that people start, eyes rolling around in their heads. The second, I think, has to do with that the nature of the shifts that we want to make have to be based in systems. And we have a tendency, even though there may be statistics to show that correlation between healthcare and math, I still think it's a little bit more complicated than that. So the whole issues of teacher training, about funding for public schools, about training of administrators, about the nature of curriculum, healthcare issues, social emotional development, all these things are integrated in some sense in terms of influencing how systems of education operate. And what we don't have, I think, and I think there have been allusions to this across the remarks, is that we don't really have, as researchers, a strong sense of how to communicate, understanding how policy systems operate in order to be able to communicate with them. And we tend to operate from the assumption that if we have logic and data behind the claims that we make, that that's sufficient when it's not. The two other short final points is, one is we also have to wrestle, I think, with one of the reasons that we keep revisiting this dilemma is because there's an underlying ideology that's part of the American sort of psyche and story, and we have very difficult times wrestling with it. That America, the United States, represents one of the most powerful experiments in democratic governance, I think, in the history of the world. But it's born on the back of 2 Holocausts. And that schizophrenia is one that we have not been able to resolve. And therefore, this sort of meta-narrative about social hierarchies of human beings keeps coming up every decade, one way or another. So if in the past years, it may have been the IQ deficit thing. And so now it's the executive control amongst, if you're poor. But there's an underlying logic that we haven't wrestled with because we haven't dealt with this fundamental schizophrenia.
Could you just explain what you mean by the 2 Holocausts? What are you referring to?
The African Holocaust of enslavement and the genocide of the indigenous populations.
Okay.
And then finally, that there is I think for dealing with this schizophrenia, there's a special role that public education plays. Amy Gutman had made this argument in democratic education that the only institution in a democracy where we can more likely influence young people to be socialized to engage in civic debate, meaning the ability to see the other side, consider alternative perspectives, is in public education. And yet that typically is not a focus of what we do in schooling or what we actually talk about in terms of goals for education.
So, next year. So Kris Gutierrez.
Yeah. So I'm going to focus on the first half of before the colon, knowledge to action. And I'm looking at the demographics of this room. So this little slogan may not resonate because I wanted to start with quoting the rapper Missy Elliott, who says, flip it and reverse it. Because I do social cultural theory. I'm a learning scientist who uses this lens. And we would argue that knowledge comes, I think Catherine was getting at this, knowledge comes from action. Knowledge comes from participating in practices. Practices is really important to those of us who do social cultural theory. So action is not just carrying something out. Instead, we gain knowledge in action. So I guess if I were rewriting it, I would talk about cycles of knowledge in action. And yes, we use prior knowledge to participate, but the learning is always in that new action. So what if we were to take that slogan, flip it and reverse it as an organization and as a profession? What does it mean to start to think about our work differently? My colleague Bill Penuel and I tried to do that in a piece where we talked about relevance to practice as a criterion for rigor, right? And I think what it was is a call for us to rethink the way we do our work, the kinds of partnerships that Linda was talking about, a complete reversing of the way we think about what our role as academics are in terms of serving the social and public good, right? I think a lot of us had that theme, and I don't think it's an accident that our tagline as presidents was, yes, of course, contribute to the knowledge base, but how can we use that knowledge base in the service of something more consequential, right? So I think there's a real need. The flip it and reverse it speaks to a new kinds of criticality and new kinds of consequential action that's needed as an organization, as a profession, and about the way we think about our work.
Okay. So back to Bill Tierney. Yeah, got it. Okay.
My guess is that when we all saw this title, none of us thought that the fellow who'd be in the White House would be the person who's in the White House today. So in part, context matters. How we define knowledge and how we define action. So let me talk about this personally in 3 ways. I'm concerned about how do we increase access to college for low-income first-generation youth. So for about 10 years now, I've been working on how to figure out if kids play games in high school, will that increase the possibility of them getting into college and succeeding? And I've gotten lots of funding from all the regular places. And I know a lot more today than I did 10 years ago, which is a good thing. I could learn less than I did 10 years ago, so that's a plus. But I think of that sort of as the scientific part of me, and I am by no means ready to say anything definitive about that. But there's a second part of me in terms of implementation and innovation, because I work with schools and I try to help them think through how do we get more kids into college. And to me, there's a part of science there, but there's also a part of art, and I can talk about that. But, you know, all of us in this room lived through Bush and Iraq and all that, and that to me was bad, but distinctly different from today. And where I go back to right now, how I am feeling, is when I was a young faculty member living through AIDS and helping to start ACT UP and trying to figure out, it's scary enough to be an assistant professor and figure out what you're supposed to do. But when you have friends literally in the office next to you who are dying, you really feel, I can't just sit here and figure out what's the next formula for me to do. I have to act, and I do know some things. And that's the way I feel today. So when the governor of Texas says any institution that declares itself a sanctuary university, I will take all of its funding, I know enough to say that's bad educational policy, that our universities support all students, and to take money because we're supporting our students is bad. When the Secretary of Education says that HBCUs are a superb example of school choice, I know enough to say that's a false fact, and I'm going to call you on it. And to go further abroad, when the president of Turkey fires every single dean in every university and fires faculty and imprisons them, I know enough as an American academic that that's an infringement on academic freedom, and I will speak up. And that's what I want AERA to think about as well.
Interesting. So if we can pass it over to Barbara. Pass it. There you go. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to go very deep on action. As many of you know, I study low-income and minority kids, trying to get them to go to college. We've built a lot of mechanisms for doing that. And most recently, we've taken that word and the things that we've found in terms of course sequences, opportunities to work with robotics, and went to Detroit, which basically has not really given a great deal of resources to public education except in very specialized schools. And we've sold that message to businesses. And I'm very happy to report that businesses understand there will not be people to hire if, in fact, the education system doesn't get better. And they've weighed in very substantial kinds of ways, including offering robotics programs to some of these schools that have never had that opportunity. The second thing that's happened to me, which I think is really important for the people in this room, we went and showed our results to PBS Detroit. We started talking to the people in PBS Detroit about the schools and what could be done. I'm very happy to report that there was an alumni who happened to have been the producer of PBS Detroit, and he is going to do a very big expose on the schools in Detroit and fold it into the American Graduate. I think that these are the kinds of actions that we need to take. I'm a child of the 60s. I marched. I did a lot of crazy things. And when it was all over, I sat back and said, what happened? And the promise hasn't been fulfilled. I'm trying a different way this time. And I would say, go local, talk to the people that can get to the people, and see if you can't make a difference.
Okay, well, as the last one standing here, you'll see how much I have been influenced by all of those who come before in what I have to say. And in many ways, I want to run right back to where Frank Farley started us off. The mic is not working. Which would be. Okay, well, I'm going to take you right back to where Frank started. And that has to do with the action part. It will very much be about flipping it, as Kris suggests, and I think a lot about local as well. But I think, we've learned, if we've learned nothing else over the last 50, 60 years since we tried to get at equal educational opportunity through a rational use of data, that equity, a policy and practice does not come about because of the technical precision of our work. It's very important. It's very important that we do it and that we inform those who can influence and make policy about our work. But it really turns, equity and opportunity turns on the cultural dimensions, the beliefs, I think, that Catherine was talking about, and the politics, the power relations that really determine the distribution of things and who has access and who has opportunity. So I think, last year my theme was about public scholarship for diverse democracies, and little did I know what a crisis that we would be in a year later and how badly we need public scholarship. And by that, I mean both the effective use of every technology and medium we have to do compelling translation of our work, but also about engagement, about having the knowledge arise from action in partnership with those in the midst of the problems and the issues that we hope to inform and create better opportunity. And that means that we do our work not for educators or religious leaders or artists or communicators, but we do it with them because it's only in that kind of partnership that we'll get the compelling storytelling, the political activism, and the links to professional practice that are so important. It's not as though we can transform ourselves and take on ourselves all of those roles. I mean, we do have a job to do and an important role to play, but it's in partnership with those who can help change the cultural dimensions and the politics that will make a difference. And I think about, we're not lone heroes, right? Swooping in to help solve the problems of the disadvantaged. That in fact, our knowledge is only good and robust if it's done in that kind of partnership. And I think about W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about how lost from the world an experience of untold wisdom that we suffer because of our neglect to think of knowledge partners and knowledge creators as beyond our own universe. And, that intellectuals cannot speak for them, but intellectuals have a very special responsibility to seek out those who've been silenced and help those voices be part of our intellectual conversation if we're thinking about changing not only the technical dimensions of our practices, but the culture and the politics that makes them reflect our values and our hopes and dreams. And I think about Kenneth and Mamie Clark, famous mid-century 1950s examples of public intellectuals who took a big risk and joined together with Thurgood Marshall and used their research in the Briggs case, and it became a famous footnote in Brown versus Board of Education. They suffered from doing that. They were disparaged, often by their peers, for taking on a role that was not appropriate for a scholar, some would say. Others would nitpick about their methodology or their findings, and they weren't pure enough or accurate enough or well-defined enough to be useful. But they stepped out, and they were not afraid to be on the right side of a history of changing the conversation. Of course, it's only one tiny piece of a complicated puzzle, but they were there participating in partnership in ways of using knowledge into action. And we should say, we should not also forget that Kenneth Clark later became the president of the American Psychological Association. So he was on the right side of psychology as well. So.
Well, that was fascinating. I think every one of you could have talked for half an hour and we would have been engaged, but we don't have the whole afternoon, unfortunately. I do want to really make this an interactive conversation, so I want to just ask a couple of questions myself to get the conversation going, and then we do want to turn to the audience. So just kind of situating, why this year the theme was chosen well before, the election, right? So, we have a different kind of, situation now than I think most of us expected. So we're more than 8 years since the election of the first African-American president. His time in office coincided with significant changes. Now we're several months into the term of a president whose election was seen as a backlash of sorts to the Obama presidency. So how does the theme speak to what the nation has experienced in recent years and serve as a guide for the national conversation going forward?
I was last before, so I'm going to take the privilege of being first now.
Right.
I think one thing that the theme struck for me since November 2016 is that we have to now make problematic the very words and concepts of opportunity and access. I think they're being, like so many of our ideas and our language, being co-opted in a way that can be very dangerous and very damaging. The fact that inequality can continue to be okay and justified as long as we provide opportunity and access. And I think we can see this in the healthcare debate right now. The shift in language from not providing health care for all Americans, but if you listen carefully, the argument is we should provide the opportunity and the access to health care for all Americans. And I am desperately worried that those concepts in education will lead us down the same kind of slippery slope.
Right. Want to pass the, there you go, right here. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry. I think that this whole notion of hyper-nationalism, America first, can possibly stimulate the whole notion of looking at the other as a deficit. And I think that we see that with the popularity of Ruby Payne's book, A Framework for Understanding Poverty, which never went away, but I think now may become a kind of modal way of thinking. So I think that this hyper...
I'd explain that a little bit more. Could you explain that a little bit more? Explain where
she kind of marginalizes the poor, and that she's very popular in schools, and that the poor, in effect, it's a culturally deficit model. It's the kind of model that came out of the 1960s of looking at people who didn't achieve, blaming the victim, in other words. Ryan, in a book called it Blaming the Victim, is looking at those who didn't succeed academically as their fault, rather than looking at institutions and restructuring those institutions. So I think this hyper-nationalism creates the perfect setting for those kind of deficit conceptions, including the Jensen deficit, cultural deficit, genetic deficit conception, that those are likely to ascend and become really powerful.
Does anybody disagree with that?
They've never gone away.
They never went away, but I think this provides an opportunity for them to rise and to be more influential.
But poverty is the new pseudonym for race is poverty. There's very little attention, for example, to poor whites in places like Appalachia or Mississippi Delta. And again, going back to the original point that I made, there is this schizophrenia of a meta-narrative about race and positioning of human beings and who gets to be human and who doesn't get to be human. And you can go, if you're doing a history across disciplines, or looking at policies, we still keep coming back to that. The other issue around meta-narratives is to why is it that Europe has no problem providing social supports in the form of universal health care? And in the United States, this meta-narrative about individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that a big challenge that we're facing in all the work we're doing is how do we begin in a public arena at all levels of the system to begin to interrogate these deeply seated belief systems that inform all these decisions. None of this stuff is new.
Well, and there's also the structural elements of it, right? So it's not just individual beliefs, but it's the way in which it's embedded in all of the structures of inequality that we have. And to Jeannie's point and Jim's and Carol's as well, that this whole choice narrative, which sounds like it's about individual freedom, everybody deserves a choice. It's all American to have choices. But the fact that there aren't enough in places that have really, choice becomes synonymous with privately operated schools or potentially privately run schools that are attended through vouchers. The fact that there aren't enough schools worth choosing for the young people who are at the, kind of bottom of that, set of beliefs that Carol and Jen were just talking about, and that they do not get chosen by the schools that are worth choosing is not surfaced. The organizational and institutional elements of that are things that we have to bring out because the rhetoric of choice and freedom is so powerful and sounds so individual, and we need to give individual parents and families opportunities. I agree with that, but the goal of a public education system has to be to create a system of schools worth choosing in which every child gets chosen by a good school. And that is an institutional set of issues around funding, around the allocation of opportunities, around the design of public school systems, and a variety of other things that will be hidden from the public conversation unless we really bring them out. The fact that most choices, by the way, are in district-run public schools is not something people think about. They go immediately to a governance idea, which, as it's played out in places that have gone very far down that path, have left many, many young people without any choice at all, but in settings that are not even minimally adequate to meet their needs.
Sure, go ahead.
Real quick.
Is that working?
Yeah, I think Jim and Carol, of course, Linda, you're always right, but I'm going to highlight what Jim said. Jim brings up a very important point.
Go.
You have to create an other. When you're crushing people, you have to create a symbolic index. That's Carol's point about being human. So if you can create something that's not human, right, then you don't have to invest resources in something that isn't human. And I think Jim and Carol are really saying very complimentary things. And I'm going to go back to something I said earlier in doing the GIS work in Missouri. Part of the strategy politically is to demonstrate that the humans in the boot hill of southern Missouri are having very similar experiences, negative, as the folks who have been demonized and viewed as non-human in these urban communities. And then when you begin to marinate with that and work with people around these commonalities in their human condition, you have an opportunity politically to create some type of leveraging in a state context. Absent that, I'm afraid all you have is the symbolic index that Carol is referring to as these non-humans in these urban environments, another code word for Black or Hispanic. And I don't think you can win state politics given the strength of rural communities without demonstrating this commonality. And I think that's a big deal for us as researchers. And I'm going to say I raise my hand as guilty. I look back at the last 15 years of my papers that had the state of Missouri on it. I didn't have one set of recommendations for a rural community. And I told my students that was a big fail by your major professor. Absolutely, we're seeing the exact same things. We should have been talking about that. We need to fix this. And I think that's part of the dilemma. All of us, we have our little lens, and it's that deal we want to work on, but we're not seeing how there's some commonalities we can pull upon. And I think that's really going to be the challenge for us going forward.
Frank, here?
Yes.
And
so can I just, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Frank.
Are you sure? Yeah.
Friends, we really know how to debate topics. We do it brilliantly. And we don't, we got horsepower to burn. but we're not moving down the road. Why? Because the clutch is slipping. We're not translating what we're doing into action. And that is what we need to do. Otherwise, we'll be back again next year kicking around these things brilliantly, as we do. And in my view, what AERA has got to do, if you want to change the world or just talk about it, we're going to have to take some measures. And I mentioned at the outset that the media is where everybody lives these days, so we got to be there 24/7 in all the guises that we can and all the ways that we can. And, stories, pictures, anecdotes, this is what changes the 21st century world. Look at the Syrian children being washed down after being gassed and how that changed the world. We need those kind of pictures that represent the things that we believe in for education change.
And you've got a lot of photogenic subjects, children and teens, and so
we need to arrive at points of agreement on major issues and then have to start moving them into the public debate and into the state houses and into the federal legislation, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, we will just be back here again next year with some brilliant ideas, but we won't have changed the world.
Right.
So I just wanted to kind of pick up on something that Bill was saying, because I guess it's the historian in me that suggests we've been here before. Technologies have changed, but the opportunity for poor whites and black folks to coalesce is this part of the story of the U.S., and every time the opportunity is presented, it is rejected, because the ability to hold on to the label of whiteness, even if I don't have health care, even if my kids can't get a decent education, at least I can be white. And I think that there is this, gets back to Carol's point about the meta-narrative. I think about, Ian Haney Lopez's notion of the dog whistle politics. There's certain things I can say, welfare, urban, ghetto, that I don't have to give you a full and robust description of what I mean, because it's so ingrained in us. And if I'm rural white, I'm saying that's not me. I'm looking now at the difference in our response to the opioid. I'm like, dude, all of a sudden, because it's, quote, another group of people who are struggling with drug abuse, now we're thinking again about treatment, but we have mass incarceration with people who are all put in there for drug offenses. So until we grapple with this narrative that Carol's talked about, until we grapple with the fact that fundamentally we don't think some people are worthy, we're going to keep bringing ourselves back to this place.
Well, let's have one more comment on this, and then we should probably move to more of the, I'd say, knowledge to action piece a little bit.
So I want to just make a comment that I hope will be self-referential for us.
Okay.
We would be naive to assume, I agree with you, Frank, that we have homogeneity around our beliefs about what would be best practice or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And that maybe one of the things that we need to do is to create some maybe sort of more stable structures through which we can begin to interrogate one another. So things like the Hart and Risley study in language of what them study, was it 45 families or something, and then extrapolating from what they found from those 45 families to make this generic claim that kids in poor communities, poor families, don't have language when they're coming to school. Or James Heckman's current work, which is getting really popular now because people are trying to put their warrants in the neurosciences. So if they think they can make that claim, that gives it some sort of rigor about, again, poor children not having executive functioning and executive control. We have a lot of internal debating and struggle to get to the point of going before policy audiences in one level. And it's a natural aspect in some sense of the nature of science growing and developing. And that's why I think that metaphor that Ed Gordon had about the ships working under the assumption that the world was flat at a time when there's new work emerging that maybe it's round. That's where we are, I think. We have to acknowledge that.
Okay.
Plus, we have leaders who are insisting that the world is flat.
And any other view is an alternative fact.
Well, I
That's
just,
because they're seeing it from the level of the swamp, I think.
I just wanted to bring in a few more folks who talked, really specifically about the idea of, being public intellectuals and, turning kind of research evidence into how do you find pathways to action, really. How do you, and we talked a lot about brilliant debate, how do you go from that scholarly discourse into efforts that really will generate public will? A number of you have suggested ways to do that. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
So we're doing that. Linda, you should
Yeah.
talk about yours.
And I know,
I've heard
Catherine,
this.
you
No.
were talking
Well, I was just going to
about
say, in
this.
St. Louis, we started this initiative for the sake of all project, which basically brought together in a horizontal and vertical way researchers, practitioners, public health officials, et cetera, and talked about what we can do to change state policy. We laid out a set of clear targets that had specific resources and began talking to state legislative folks about it, the city, council members, et cetera. And it's going really well, and it's a great collaboration where it was initiated in a university, but we realized we would only be talking to ourselves if that's the way we kept it, and we got all the folks involved in the community.
And what's the upshot? What's the
Well,
upshot?
we're slugging through. I mean, it's a war. The upshot is we're in a battle, working and communicating and trying to do the best we can with the information we have to the different constituents in the state. PBS has been helpful. Many other journalists have been helpful. And I think we'll know in a few years. Look, if we fail fundamentally, St. Louis is going to go under. I mean, we have to win. We don't have a choice. I mean, otherwise, we're going to have third world countries in the middle of biotech hubs, right? I mean, so we really have to try to be successful, and that's where we are, and it is really local. I don't even think about what's happening in the federal level. I'm in the middle of a war. I don't have to, I just don't have time. Yeah. But everybody has their own take on it, but I'm not waiting on the feds to save me. I'm down in, a border South state. I'm in war.
Linda, I think you think a lot more about the federal level.
Well, I was going to talk about a state level thing and just give an example of, you have to keep at this over a long period of time. But California, as many of you know, was on a very long downward trajectory for a long time. John Merrows did a film called From First to Worst, and we were just about at worst. We would say, thank God for Mississippi when we looked at the achievement results. I mean, that was, yeah. It is. And a bunch of researchers were assembled during this very, very long slide to do a project called Getting Down to Facts. And I want to just acknowledge Susanna Loeb led that, group of, 15 studies. School finance was declining. It was unequal. Bilingual education had been outlawed. There was, every kind of downward spiraling policy in place. People looked at what the alternatives could be, what the possibilities could be, what it would cost to change the funding formula, et cetera. Nothing happened at that moment. This was in the Schwarzenegger years, but when Jerry Brown came into office, that work actually ended up in the passage of the most progressive school finance formula that probably exists in the country today, has dramatically turned around both the funding and the allocation of funds so that they go to students living in poverty, foster care children, students who are English learners. On the heels of that, as Gloria mentioned, Proposition 58 was passed, which now brings bilingual education back. That was actually also a side effect. And we're now starting once again a group of researchers on Getting Down to Facts 2 to look at where are we now, what needs to happen next, what will we hand to the next governor who will be coming in 2018, and really being practical about what the situation is with equity front and center, and then what the solutions could be.
So you got to be patient and work your way up.
I have an addition to this wonderful story, because there's more to this story. This is a very important part of the story. But in California, the stage for this was set when all of those very negative policies, anti-affirmative action, anti-bilingual, triggered the creation of a lot of grassroots activism around education equity. And that in part informed the Williams versus California, which was a piece of litigation that exposed the deplorable conditions. And so we had attorneys and advocates working, and researchers working, including the two of us, right, working in that case. And after that, when Getting Down the Facts was done by researchers, there was another statewide survey, didn't get as much attention, but it was called Getting Down to Whose Facts, where grassroots organizations, the Acorn organization, PICO, lots of others, did surveys of their own members about their views. Well, what happened about all of that is that when then Jerry Brown came in and we had some great research and some good policy development, we also had some constituents who had been angry and were organized and helped push that stuff over the top from a political perspective. So I think it's this big picture of this parallel tracks are coming together, but sort of multiple forces working on the politics.
So how involved were the researchers with the activists?
Very involved. Very involved.
In what way? In what way? Giving them talking points, or
no? Well, one of the things, Getting Down to Whose Facts study, which I was involved with, was a matter of UCLA helping to construct by interactions and dialogues with community groups what a survey might look like that could get at the perceptions of the poorest people in the state. They did all the data collection. It wasn't a scientific sample. They just gave surveys to everybody they knew and went out to grocery stores and got a huge sample, sent the data back to us. We had it processed and did some initial analyses, and then collaboratively with them wrote a report that was written in a fashion that spoke to their members as well as to others in the state. So, but that's just one example. I mean, there are many, many other examples in California, partly because the funders were smart enough to know that they needed to fund these grassroots activists at the same time as they were.
Philanthropy always plays a role. Before, just hold that thought for 1 minute. I just want to say we're about to open it up to questions. So think about your questions and then raise your hand. I thought we were going to have a microphone, but I don't. So maybe we should just have it up here. It's hard to pass in a room this big, so I would probably say kind of come up to the front here. Is that maybe on the side here? Is that okay? And we'll give you a microphone. How about that? So like come up here and ask your questions. And even if you have questions you want to start lining up, that's also okay. So Bill.
Let's recognize you gotta act.
And to be honest right now, to be acting locally in California, in Los Angeles, is pretty comfy. Yeah, I said to Bill the other day, nationally, there's a 10% drop in international students coming to the United States. At USC, there's a 10% increase. And the provost thinks it's largely because we have the name California in it. But having said that, and it sounds such a strange thing to have to do this now, but the federal government is enormously powerful. We know that. And we need to be clear with the Department of Education that knowledge is not just something you get to make up. So that when research proposals come out, we need to emphasize that these need to be peer reviewed. We need to emphasize that when a researcher does research, that it's his or her research that can be disseminated. It's not embargoed because it happens to be against the policies of the Trump administration. And if we ignore that, we are at our own risk, however comfy it is for me being back in LA.
That's a very long-standing issue, the issue of the department sitting on research and researchers not feeling like they can talk to the press. I mean, we've dealt with that for years and years. So would this be a real change in past practice?
I think it will be. The potential is that it will be an enormously significant change. I mean, I have never been my data is my data in terms of the research that I've done. I certainly in the Department of Navy and other places, things are embargoed. But by and large, the thought that, look at what's happening right now with studies that pertaining to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned the other day, and not only is it embargoed, but that it's being erased.
Well, is this something that AERA is trying to act on behalf of the research community for, with like advocating with the department and the IES? Or?
The newest, oldest president would.
I think, part of its mission is advocacy for both the resources and the support for good data and the norms and ethics of data building and public data. I think that it's been, I think it has definitely not been strong enough in the past to accomplish what we need, and it is definitely not strong enough in the current environment. And we talked a bit about it, some of us the other day, about how we really need a strategic plan and a much more activist arm. And those of us who've been around for a while need to become real advocates and help push both this organization and then in turn the organization push the public and the government on these very issues.
Right.
Perhaps we need an Orwell project in AERA to keep and preserve what at least we have.
Right.
Each of us in this room will be assigned a certain document to memorize.
So at this time, does anybody have any questions that they want? I would say come on up here and we'll give you. There you go. Thank you. And I can, when you're done, pass it on. Okay, go ahead. And a couple of ground rules. Say who you are and make it a question, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mira Debs. I'm at Yale University, and I study school choice. And one of the things that I'm increasingly troubled by in this rhetoric of a school choice that's right for every parent's individual child, as DeVos keeps saying, is kind of an underlying assumption that some choices are good for certain children and some choices are good for other children. And this is something that I'm trying to address in my research on public Montessori schools, and I'm just curious what kind of advice folks on the panel would give in terms of countering this narrative of choice and the underlying messages about the segregation impact of choice.
Anybody want to tackle that? That's a lot of questions there. And yeah.
I'll say, yeah, go ahead. Catherine wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't have any advice for you at all except be strong. But this is one very specific case of these issues where facts are not all that relevant to these parents, right? I mean, you can say, oh, look, these schools generate poorer scores or less adequate graduation rates than these other schools. That is not the only reason that parents pick schools for their kids. They pick schools for all kinds of reasons. Carol alluded to some of them, right? They don't want their kids going to school with other kinds of kids. They want, parents have long had the opportunity to choose schools for reasons of religion, and we wouldn't want to denounce that, perhaps. I mean, I would, but most people probably wouldn't. But some parents choose single-sex schools. Some parents choose that. These are values. This is not something where you counter the decision by saying the test scores are lower or vouchers don't improve outcomes, right? In order to understand this and to change people's decisions, we need to broaden our sensitivity to the perspectives from which people are making decisions. The kind of thing that only happens, for example, that Bill was talking about when you actually get
poor people of different colors talking to each other so that they can understand each other's perspectives and perhaps find a common ground. But it is all about perspective. It isn't all about facts.
But I would like to say something about a few facts that would be helpful. Although there are
You can tell me, you can convince me, Linda, but you can't convince the parents.
Well, no, I think there's the choice rhetoric leads to people thinking that this is about parents' decisions for their children. But we just did a study in New Orleans, which is now this year all charter, and for large numbers of African American families in low-income communities, there is no choice. They line up at the district office to try to get some kind of school that they could send their kids to. They end up having to go to schools they don't want to go to. Nobody chose these schools. We interviewed children, parents, worked with community members. There's a group in New Orleans called Researchers on Reform who have been collecting these data, and choice is not what is actually happening there for most children. There are some people who get to choose a small number of schools that are high quality schools that you would send your own child to possibly. And if you're white in New Orleans, you have a 90% chance of being in the tier 1 schools that are selective in their admissions. If you're black in New Orleans, you have a 25% chance of getting into any of those schools. The schools degrade in quality to a level that is so low that it's basically really connected to the penal institutions and the school to prison pipeline, and kids will say things like, well, I went down there were no schools open to me, so they assigned me a school. When the woman told me the school I had to go to, I said, well, didn't somebody get killed there last week? She said, yeah. That's choice for that child. It's like, I don't want to go there, but that's where you have to go. Parents who are sending kids to 5 different schools because that's where they could get in, 2-hour bus rides in the dark, to neighborhoods that are unsafe. So choice is not choice.
So Kris, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's related because it goes back to the fundamental
I just want to say the data on that has to be available because otherwise people imagine choice from a different perspective.
I just real quickly want to say, this reminds me of when Linda asked me to go in her stead to debate McCain's education person during the 2008 election it was about English learners. And I had all my facts, of course, and all the policies that Linda had sent me. And, and here I was doing my job. And then she would say, but my uncle's brother's friend said this. Right? And it would trump it. That was a Latino audience, so I could come back and say, well, my tío and tía said this, and so I won the debate. But the point was that there is no shared understanding. There's no shared narrative. And we know from learning, right, that if you don't have that kind of shared kind of understanding, you can't move to action. And there's such a big disconnect that I think we keep avoiding when we think about doing the kind of work that we want to do.
Well, and that story doesn't get told for the reasons that Carol and Jim were pointing out earlier.
Right. Do we have a question here? Kris, do you have
Okay. Hi, my name's Elizabeth, and I'm a graduate student in Baltimore. And this is like the who's who of my bibliography for my dissertation, so I'm starstruck. But my question is, and somebody kind of alluded to it on here about how we have all of this quantitative data, but that certainly was trumped by the qualitative story that was told in the election. And how do you see that kind of playing out in research when you talked about pictures and stories sell, but then you have other people who are quantitative folks that are like, that's a nice story about that kid so in such and such place and a nice picture, but what data do you have to back it up? So how do you mesh those?
So I would actually say that it's not an either-or phenomena. I was in graduate school a long time ago, and Lee J. Kronbach told us, stop making these distinctions, that both forms of analysis help us. The quantitative can be used to serve the qualitative and vice versa. All of us do other things. And so one of the things I do is I work for some community nonprofits and charities. One of my charities has no trouble raising money because it has a strong narrative. And in fact, its quantitative information would have you think differently about your giving, and that is the Susan G. Komen. Because the truth of the matter is, most women are not dying from breast cancer, they die from heart disease, but they don't have a good story. Coleman has a great story about these two sisters and the promise that one sister made the other. And so you've got to be able to craft a narrative out of the robust data. I know Barbara can speak to some of this stuff, but she and Tony, when they did that study in Chicago, what really, I think, spoke to people was not 500 schools, it's this story about relational trust. Everybody's like, oh my God, really? So we really, we have to stop having these pseudo wars about research tools. We need to use everything at our disposal.
So when we speak to business communities, when we speak to the larger social media, we come armed with both. And we spend a lot of time on the narrative that we're going to tell. We have the pictures, we have the stories, we have the numbers. And I feel that our success has been because we have integrated both of lots of ways of telling the story. And you can pretty much know by looking at certain cues when you're sitting someplace where people want you to go and where they don't want you to go. And if they say, what's the evidence? You always have something to point to. If they want to know more about the narrative, you have more stories to tell. But you have to have both. I would like to say one little thing that I'm going to be the, I don't know what you would call me, but I suppose a person on the outside. I work with rural schools, I work with urban schools, I work with poor white children, I work with poor black children, brown children. My white rural kids, parents, there's no way in the world. It's going to take generations before these people come together with any other group. They share a very different cultural history, a very different understanding of the world. And I'm not saying it's bad, it's just not the same. And it isn't the just being white. It has lots to do with generations of people living in certain places, the cultural understanding that they have, the narrative that they speak to each other in. It isn't so easy to kind of form a group of people because they share certain kinds of characteristics of being poor. And when we're there, you really start to understand this in a way that you have never understood it before. And I would caution us against thinking that this is some group of people that because they don't have that income will come together. That has not been the situation that we've seen, certainly in rural Michigan and urban Michigan.
Fascinating. Can I just add, though, that one of the things that I think that we have to also keep in mind, that one of the, I think, sort of brilliant aspects of the conception of this democracy is that there should be sufficient checks and balances and some fundamental guiding principles that don't require you to have a particular ideology or want to be with a particular people.
It's not a people, it's not a people thing, Carol. I just can give you one very good example. We talk to our black families. They want the best things for their kids. They want them to go to college. We have long conversations with them about that. You see their aspirations for their children and the dreams they want for their children. We can go to certain rural areas that are white, and the parents will talk to us. Oh, well, we really don't want our children to move away and go to college. This isn't something that, well, maybe in the future, but right now we really need your help at home. And are you sure that that's the kind of place that we want our child to go? I'm not, and I just want people to understand that there are cultural histories about people. Do I think that we can come together on this? No, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to eliminate implicit bias. I don't think we're going to solve some of these great big ideas we've been talking about. That's why I'm really pressing everybody here. Make it a little story. Go talk to the people that are in the local community. Share your data, share your narratives. Tell your story to the people that are going to listen and are going to move on that. I do lots of research, I have lots of data, I have lots of stories, I have lots of articles and books and all the rest of it. But if I want to change somebody's mind, if I want to move them and get them with me, it's a very different kind of approach. Okay. And you have to really think twice about that.
I'd ask you to leave it there. I would like to get a few more questions in. We only have 10 more minutes. So, Kris, do you want to introduce yourself? And
I'm Kris Edley from UC Berkeley Law School. Wow. let's bottle it. So my experience of junior high school was that the boys were on one side and the girls were on the other side, and that each side was sort of interested in dancing, but perceived the other side as not so interested in dancing, or at least it would be scary to dance. So if I put on my political and policy hat, that's what talking to education researchers often feels like to me. That each side has the perception that the other side is either lacking in interest or lacking in receptor sites, however you want to frame it. And from my political and policy side, I think the problem is that it's too hard for those of us on the demand side of the equation to find people to dance with. And I'm sure there are researchers who feel like they have the secret sauce, but can't find anybody who wants to drink it. I think that's an important problem to work at. And a bunch of ideas about how to do it spring to mind. But I think that is an important it's an important thing to think about. It's both creating more receptor sites bilaterally and being very intentional about making some of the connections. Point number one. The other thing I suggest is knowing what you're not so great at. And by and large, in my experience, education researchers are not so great at thinking about public policies that will take promising research results to scale. Just not your thing. You didn't study the right stuff. Very few of you have spent any time in government in policymaking roles, so you don't know what's entailed. There again, it seems to me the question is, who will you find to be partners? Or what bridging institutions, like the Learning Policy Institute, will you create to do that intermediation rather than expecting either side of the dance hall to reinvent themselves and be something that they are not really trained to do. So I would just say, if anybody can figure it out, it's this amazing group of people, and just find some other partners on the other side, and give us the choreography so we can dance.
You know, if you take a look at break dance versus ballet, there are actually amazing similarities. And I think that's true of the world of ideas. You know, you dig deep enough, you're going to find some common ground. And life is simpler than it seems, in my view. And we tend in the academe and related worlds to way over complex things. We use a language that most folk can't relate to. And, we don't follow the rule of simplicity. The great British physicist, Lord Rutherford, once said, if you can't explain your theory to your local bartender, it has no chance of being proved true. And I agree with that. I've been toasting that in many bars. And Einstein has also said, of course, keep it simple, but not too simple. And look at the jargon that we have in this field. I mean, it's an astounding accomplishment, isn't it? And back to your dance metaphor, you know, you take ballet, you take break dance, you take a lot of different forms of dance, and actually there are a lot of commonalities there.
Kris, can't resist to pick up on your dance metaphor and quote my dear friend Carol Lee, because when she was president and I was president-elect, people know Carol and I like to dance. So we had danced a lot, and she was remarking that some of our colleagues danced differently than we did. But she turned that into a brilliant lecture the next day of how much it related to our research and our teaching. She said, you know, it was different, and Kris and I were dancing, and she said, but the first thing you had to do was figure out what was the beat in their head. And once you found the beat in their head, we could dance. And I've never forgotten that. I thought that was a wonderful way to think about it.
Any other questions from, here we go.
Sure. Melissa Martinez from Tucson, Arizona, high school teacher, and thank you to everyone for everything without going individually. But I especially thank Dr. Farley, Dr. Banks, and Dr. Ladson-Billings for framing the thoughts that have been rattling in my head. And this is just a rumination inviting comment. We are accustomed to the political spectacle of an executive action at the federal level, a Supreme Court decision, the mobilization of National Guard to enforce a decision. But so much of what happens at the state level. And I see that firsthand in Arizona. It's just the way it is. And especially, I think, in the next 4 years, with the Attorney General who is heading the DOJ, we're going to see a lot of power revert back to the states in the guise of states' rights. And so all of your points are so cohesive, and one doesn't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see that there's a coordinated effort that is nationalistic but implemented at a state level. I know in Arizona we get legislation that does not originate in Arizona, but we have to deal with it. So just your thoughts, please.
Well, I think you stated it quite accurately. That this, what I started out talking about, the hyper-nationalism, America first, and of course we have Le Pen talking about France first, that this toxic environment is really what we'll have to deal with. And I think we have to be very thoughtful in thinking that we, Arthur Schlesinger, his really illuminating book called Cycles of American History, talks about how the periods of kind of reform, then we get a period of retrenchment. So I think that, again, I started out saying Martin Luther King, the arch of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward history, but we get the downward cycle. So I think we have to be very conscious that we are in a downward cycle, and that we have to be cognizant of responding and protesting and being activists during this downward cycle and what I call a toxic cycle of American history right now.
Right. I think we have time if anyone else wants to make quick comments. Otherwise, we are pretty much out of time. Yeah, anybody? We have like 2 minutes, so yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a native of Arizona, I think one of the most dangerous things, to go back to the point Carol made, is for us to think that this is new stuff. There's a long history, and the most dangerous thing is not understanding that historical context. In our research and our teaching, there's a long history there, and if we don't historicize things, it just paralyzes us and makes it harder to move to action.
And in terms of working with partners, which has been a theme, that legislation that's coming to Arizona that derives from elsewhere and is traveling around the country, probably some of it from the American Legislative Exchange Council, for example. I will just reassure you to know that there are some efforts among those who are trying to develop evidence-based policies around various educational issues to do that in partnership with other organizations that are trying to dance with those in the policymaking community who do want to do the right thing to advance equity. And we have to be engaged in finding those partners and creating that dance even while we watch what is going on and be ready to counter it.
So thank you. We are at the end of our time. So I hope everyone will give our presidents a big round of applause. Thank you.